Hi folks. In this video, I'm going to discuss what is probably the state of the art in strategic planning. It's called contingency planning, and it's the method that strategic planners use to prepare for alternative futures, or more than one possibility, because today business conditions change frequently and sometimes unpredictably. And for that reason, we need to prepare for more than one possibility. So let me bring a slide up here so that we can get started. And there it is. First, a little bit of history to put contingency planning into perspective. Strategic planning as we know it today has been around for a long time. The more modern methods of strategic planning probably emerged after the Second World War, when officers returned from the war with military planning methods and applied them in business. So we see what are considered to be more modern planning methods emerging in the late 1950s, certainly in the 1960s and 1970s. Frankly, strategic planning had been around for a lot longer than that. It was used by Sun Tzu, the Chinese general, almost 500 years before Christ, and in Greece at about the same time. So it's not something terribly new. As a matter of fact, a guy named Henri Fayol introduced it before the turn of the century in the 1890s in France, and used it to manage his mining companies with great success. He was so successful in introducing strategic planning methods that he received 2 awards from the French Academy of Sciences, the second of which was a very prestigious award. He wrote a book about his planning methods in the early 1900s. And about that time, comprehensive strategic planning had started to be used by some companies in the United States, including railroads. But in its modern form, comprehensive strategic planning is probably something that grew in substance after the Second World War, and perhaps even after the Korean War. And back then, comprehensive strategic planning was not a very efficient process. We knew it was a good one because there was some research that compared companies that did strategic planning to companies that did not do strategic planning, and later companies that did strategic planning well compared to those who didn't use such sophisticated methods. And usually the results showed that planners and more sophisticated planners had better financial results than the others. Nevertheless, it took a long time and a lot of effort to do good planning, because good planning requires the assembly of good evidence. By that I mean gathering evidence about the external environment, the economy, markets served by the firm and its various subsidiaries, and the various industries in which they participate. And that evidence is needed to make good strategic decisions. Not only do we have to gather evidence about trends and the current situation in those respects, but planners try to anticipate and forecast what the likely future conditions will be. That was very important in military planning. However, as you might imagine, it has become increasingly difficult in modern years due to turbulence, uncertainty, rapid change of business conditions. So there grew to be a community of academics. And as I have said in this, in the third bullet in this slide, they were led and fed by Henry Mintzberg, who wrote prolifically, beginning in the 1970s through the 1990s, in 1994 publishing a famous book called The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning. And Mintzberg and his followers proclaimed that planning wasn't realistic or practical because we cannot predict the future. And if we can't predict the future, managers cannot plan for what they don't know. And this became a very popular point of view. Even though Mintzberg himself, although a very prolific writer and a very brilliant one, really had no realistic, no practical experience in corporate management. He never held an executive job in a corporation, certainly not in a strategic capacity. And so he wrote, based on his rather limited observations of corporate management. I say these things not out of disrespect for Henry Mintzberg. I've sat in several sessions with him, and he's a most impressive mind. However, if you will, when we think about pragmatism, just imagine a chief executive officer of a corporation standing in front of his board of directors or his shareholders or her shareholders, proclaiming that I really don't do strategic planning. I just manage this company by walking around, based upon what I think will work today. There was a famous saying by a guy named Peters during this time, who proclaimed that the best chief executives managed by walking around, that is, staying in touch with what was going on in the business. And in fact, the same time Mintzberg and Peters were making these statements, chief executives all over the world, and especially the United States, were very busy developing their planning departments and more sophisticated planning methods. Nevertheless, Mintzberg and his followers were at least partly correct. At that time, the internet did not exist. Desktop computers and spreadsheets and email and cloud computing, simulation systems, all sorts of mathematical and artificial intelligence methods that we have today, including project planning software, did not exist back then. And so communication between divisions and subsidiaries of complex multinational enterprises with the headquarters had to be done by teletype or snail mail, or telephone, which wasn't very effective in transferring lots of data. Calculations weren't done even by electric calculators. I remember, I'm one of those poor people who had to use a mechanical calculator they were very clumsy and very slow. Later on, we had electronic calculators, and that was really a step forward, but we were still doing calculations by hand. So back then, it was very difficult to do comprehensive strategic planning in all but the simple businesses, businesses that were engaged just in one industry, one market, where the business was pretty well self-contained. So assembling plans was a tedious and time-consuming matter. Gathering evidence about the external environment, the economy, markets, and industry. Gathering evidence about internal capabilities, the resources of the firm, its skills to make use of those resources. Interpreting trends and developing forecasts about the external environment and internal capabilities. All these things were cumbersome, slow, and tedious. And the difficulties with corporate complexity grew. I see that I have a word there that says group. I'm going to fix that right now because the word is group. I use a digital voice system, and every once in a while the digital voice recognition system doesn't understand me perfectly. So these difficulties grew with corporate complexity. And multinational corporations probably had the most difficulty of all with comprehensive strategic planning, which did work in self-contained businesses, such as banks, where the whole business was located in one place. And the market that was served before we got into interstate banking especially, was pretty well defined. And forecasts could be made. And the Federal Reserve System provided plenty of good information. And the banks had, in the beginning in the 1960s, large mainframe computers that they could use to do calculations. And so strategic planning became obviously popular and powerful when it was located in the right kind of business. But in the most complex businesses, it was still very difficult to implement. And then the internet arrived. And then email, and desktop computers, and spreadsheets, and sophisticated graphics software, and project management systems like Microsoft Project, and a whole slew of smaller program management systems that followed that were even more useful for comprehensive planning. Forecasting and simulation systems, and the cloud. And with the arrival of these technologies, all these new technologies, the impediments to strategic planning that existed in the past, no matter how complex the business, evaporated. Those early impediments don't exist any longer. But academic writers still write as if they do. And so you can still today find academicians who proclaim that comprehensive strategic planning is impractical, even because they have followed the writings of Mintzberg and his followers, even though they haven't really thought it through in terms of today's technology. One exception still exists, and that is the objection to strategic planning because we cannot foretell the future. And if we can't foretell the future, it's argued, how can we plan for it? And in fact, comprehensive strategic planners, professional strategic planners with much experience will say the exact opposite. It's because we cannot foretell the future that we have to plan for it, but we use a new method to do so. In spite of the uncertainty, turbulence, and unpredictability of the future, we have all these new tools. We have rich online databases containing economic, market, and industry data maintained by organizations such as the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the U.S. Federal Reserve System, the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, industry trade groups, and on and on and on. We've got a lot of data. And I might add that, that many of the organizations that maintain these data forecast it. For instance, if you log on to the International Monetary Fund's economic database, you will find long time series of economic data about just about every country in the world, including a forecast that I believe goes to, it goes for 5 years. So, you know, forecasting has become a much more commonplace thing because our tools are better. We have more sophisticated methods and software, indeed, for predicting the future, as well as analyzing trends and capabilities inside a firm and assessing its performance potential. Lots more data, lots more tracking, lots more analysis of large databases with big data and analytics, which can be applied both to internal operating systems as well as the external environment. And now, most recently, planning managers have begun to exploit the multitude of technical advances that were not available previously when Mintzberg and his followers were writing so prolifically. They didn't have those advances and those tools to plan for alternative futures, using methods that were first developed during the war. And I should say wars, because these methods have been used even before the Second World War to plan for alternative futures. They called it contingency planning, and that's what we corporate planners still call it today, contingency planning, planning for more than one future. So we may not be able to foretell the way the future will emerge and evolve. However, we can plan for more than one path into the future and more than one outcome of the alternative paths that exist. Indeed, contingency planning today is the state of the strategic planning art. And so with that history, I'd like to just explain to you very briefly what is involved in contingency planning. Here is a diagram that I confess that I prepared myself. Some time ago, when I didn't know much about using computer graphics. So if this stuff looks a little clumsy to you, that's probably because it is, and that's because the author of this diagram is also clumsy and a little old. Anyway, what do we mean when we talk about contingencies? First of all, the environment can and does change all the time, and the scope of the external environment can be divided into 3 dimensions. If you've been in my strategic planning classes, you already know that those 3 dimensions are the economy, the broad scope that affects all markets and industries, or most can affect any market and industry. The markets themselves, that is, the sources of demand, the communities of buyers. Those are markets. And finally, the industry, which can change because new players arrive, old ones leave, methods change, and the business models change, often due to another force, which is technology. And that's the thing that's changing so very rapidly and has been for some time. And most well-informed observers think that the pace of technological change will increase. So, as technology changes, there's little doubt that industrial business models will change and firms' business models will have to change. And as technology shifts and as the environment changes, the business, which exists today as it moves through time, will also evolve. And as it does so, you can see those little red lightning bolts. Those lightning bolts are external shocks, such as war, violent weather like hurricanes, illness, outbreaks of widespread illnesses, such as the Ebola virus, floods, such as and tsunamis, and what happened in Japan when the tsunami put nuclear power plants out of business or out of work. Remember the nuclear power plant in the Ukraine, which had a meltdown. So, and that obviously affected the Ukrainian and Eastern Europe's economy. So all of these external factors, the external environment, technology, and external shocks, as well as the evolution of internal resources and capabilities, can change the performance potential of a firm. So simply to recap, I'll read the writing at the bottom of the slide. As a result of environmental changes, the economy, market, and industry, technology shifts, which are happening faster and faster, and unexpected shocks, the business has to and does evolve in at least two respects. First of all, its position in its market and its industry will change. The question is, will it change in a way that's beneficial and desirable, or will the firm simply be on the receiving end of these changes and have to react as best it can? Better if it tries to anticipate what these changes might be and plan for them. Secondly, the firm will evolve in its competitive capabilities. The key word, it turns out, is not capabilities, but competitive. If the firm's capabilities don't change, they will be over time less and less competitive. And so instead of allowing that to happen, simply accepting fate, planners are much more optimistic than that. They believe that with intellect, technology, and good methodology, they can influence the outcome of their firm's endeavors. They can influence the future of their firms. And that's why when you meet strategic planners, they may seem like nerds, but they're really very optimistic people because they believe in their methodology. Let me change the slide. So let me just run through the basic process of contingency planning for you. There's a fair amount of writing about contingency planning. As a matter of fact, I published an article about it several years ago, but there are just lots of articles about contingency planning. You will have no difficulty in learning more about it if you care to do so. So what do? First of all, we assess the contingencies. What is it that we want to consider about the changes in the future, about alternative futures? And we can do that in a fairly disciplined fashion. First, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that's driving the performance of this firm and its industry? It may be in the economy. It may be due to inflation. It may be due to exchange rates. It could be due to the growth of economies in most important country markets. It could be the evolution of developing nations' economies. It could be in a whole new way that consumers acquire the products or services that we want to offer them. Just consider how much banking and financial transactions now are occurring over the internet. It's a revolutionary change due to changes in technology. And finally, the industry structure with changes in electronic banking and financial services. In the financial services industry is changing as population densities increase. It becomes more possible for banking corporations to acquire, more likely that banking corporations will acquire what used to be neighborhood or community banks. And so the whole banking industry is consolidating. And I've just chosen the banking industry as one illustration. I could have done that to talk about electronic, the electronics industry, or just a whole host of others. Consider publishing by way of example. Anyway, so we want to identify the drivers, those variables that are pushing on our firm and its industry to make what happens, to make production happen, to make distribution happen, to make marketing functions happen, and so forth. There are some forces in the external environment that are more powerful as drivers than others. In the construction industry, by way of example, where I've spent a fair amount of time, the trends in residential construction and home buying, trends in commercial construction of office buildings and hospitals and schools, trends in industrial construction by manufacturing concerns, trends in public construction. All of those trends can be measured, monitored, and forecasted. And those trends push on the construction and construction materials industries to make things happen. Those are drivers. The other kind of contingency that we have to look at are what I refer to as techno-sociological or techno-socio, I say here, political discontinuities. What is it in technology that will change? Just as earlier I talked about the arrival of computers, the arrival of the internet, the arrival of the cloud, and so forth. Technology in chemistry, in medicine, in military hardware, in banking, and so forth. There are some major technical changes that are happening, especially in information technology. And those discontinuities, completely different ways of conducting the functions of an industry, are going to interrupt the business as usual, the status quo. They are going to change the way those drivers behave and the influence of those drivers on business models. And so we can put together mental thinking experiments. We can make a little 2x2 or 3x3, what have you, matrix, talking about one set of drivers, perhaps an economic driver, and one set of technological drivers. And we can see what the effect of those interactions might be. In short, we can conduct experiments using simulation. And by the way, that simulation doesn't have to be in the core of a computer. It can be right up here. You can do a lot of these things without invoking sophisticated computing. However, sophisticated computing certainly can help in many situations. So once we've identified the contingencies, the potential changes in drivers and potential discontinuities, and incidentally, I did not talk about social discontinuities, but we see those as a result of technology sometimes around the world. So technology and sociology can create these shocks, as well as natural, the natural environment, such as hurricanes. So we then prepare scenarios. That is, we describe what our business environment is going to look like when those drivers and technology and sociology will change. And when we do so, we can compose what are called scenarios. The term scenario refers to a short sequence of activities in a play or a movie. It's a scenario is an active scene that is created by writers for movies and plays and so forth. And way back when contingency planning was developed after the Second World War, the term scenario was voiced, and I am trying desperately to remember the name of the guy who did it. He was a very famous strategic planner who started had a lot of influence in the arrival of a new discipline called futurism, and a community of strategic planners called futurists who look into the long-term future using techniques like this. In any event, these scenarios, which can be either quantitative and expressed in a fairly rigorous, disciplined fashion, or expressed like a writer for a movie would do by telling a story. And quite frankly, most of the folks who use this method use the latter. They tell a story because there are so many interacting variables in society, in the business environment. They prefer to write a story, to tell, to try to describe what life might be like in society, or in an industry, or in a company, when certain drivers technology or social shifts occur. And they can do this in one of two ways. First, as chain reactions. So the process begins at the present, saying, here we are today. Now, how will these drivers change over time? How might they change over time? And perhaps one scenario will express the best guess. And that best guess probably provides the assumptions for the prevailing strategic plan. The problem is that that may not be the future that actually occurs. So we want to prepare other scenarios for alternative futures. We don't prepare strategies to respond to those alternative futures as comprehensively as we do prepare strategies for our best guess. However, as those scenarios, as those alternative futures seem to be becoming more likely, we'll probably flesh out those brief generalized scenarios that we form, strategies that we form, and make them more specific. And if that scenario becomes even more likely in the future, we'll put more detail to them until at some point it may be that our strategy for an alternative future, our contingent strategy, becomes more appropriate than the one that's in the strategic plan now. And so, with the benefit of careful deliberation and this process that occurs methodically over time, we will replace the old strategy with the new strategy and the old assumptions with the new ones that were developed by contingency planning. Now, there's another way to prepare scenarios, and it's gaining a lot of popularity. And that's some of the folks in the industry call it backcasting. I don't like that term, but it's popular. And the other, a better one, I think, is backtracking, because that's a term that most of us normal people use. But we can contemplate a future where something happens, something that isn't in the assumptions of our prevailing plan. By way of example, that there's a cure for cancer, or that life expectancy, instead of in modern developed countries might be in the mid 80s, goes to 125 or 150. So here's the end point that we're considering. And then we ask, what would have to happen? What conditions would have to exist for that event, for that state of affairs to occur? What kind of immunology would be necessary? What kind of changes perhaps in genetic engineering? And again, what other conditions would have to occur? And so we could begin to form a network of activities and events that would be necessary before life expectancy of 150 could occur. And once we know what those things are, we think we do, we then say, all right, now what would be necessary for that to happen? And so we work our way back, knowing that at some point we've got to come back to the future. So back to the present, rather. So we've contemplated an event in the future, and we've created a network that gets wider and wider, but then it has to get narrower and narrower as we work our way back to the present. That's backtracking. And it's a tremendously powerful tool when we get into not real long range planning, but up closer to the present. Maybe not budgeting, but something that's a little closer, because project planners like to use this to prepare the paths of activities that are going to have to happen in order to achieve something like a strategic military victory. So chain reaction, that is to say, here we are now, what's the future going to look like as all these things that we're thinking about change over time, and we drop a curtain at a certain number of years and say, okay, compared to today, what do those variables look like in this alternative future, because these drivers changed, the technology changed, and perhaps socio-political events changed. So you can imagine just how many scenarios we could come up with using this method. That's a problem. That's why often we use simulation systems, and we try to use more disciplined approaches. But that's a significant issue. And what we want to do is try to identify those scenarios that have the highest impact, that are the most consequential on our firm, or perhaps our industry, or the markets that we're serving. And there's a little technique, a device that can be used for that purpose. And I'll flip on it real quick and then come back to finish this list of activities. And there it is. And this is a matrix, or a device that is used by futurists quite a lot. And quite simply, what we do is try to measure the impact of a scenario on whatever object we're interested in, be it a firm, a market, an industry, or a whole economy, or an army, or a navy. You get it. And what is the likelihood that that scenario actually will occur? Now, in this illustration, I've used 10-point scales because it makes things easier to talk about. But you can see that the distance on each scale, that the units are equal. It's called a ratio scale. That is to say, that if I can get the pointer here, don't know if I can. But the distance between 2 and 4 is the same distance between 6 and 8, or 8 and 10. More likely in real life, we would have a logarithmic scale, you see, so that when we get 50-50, oh, I wish I could use my pointer. When we get to 50-50 on this diagram, we get a score of only 25. What that means is that if we multiply these two dimensions, impact and likelihood, and we get a score of 25 or higher, we better start doing some of that supplemental strategic planning, because we're over 50% on at least one of those scales. If we get over 44, that is to say, when the likelihood is 2/3 on both or at least one of those scales, if it's less than 2/3 on one, it's going to be a hell of a lot more than 2/3 on the other to get over 44. So when you get to more than 40, or perhaps more than 50, just to use round numbers, your contingency planning, forming alternative strategies, had better be in pretty high gear. Now, we sometimes want to do intensive strategic planning, contingency planning, even when we don't get to 25. What would happen if the impact were 10, but the likelihood were only 1? we'd have a 1 times 10 is only 10. Not very important, right? Wait a minute. What if it's a thermonuclear explosion? What if it's if it's a hurricane that wipes out a city? What if it's a real plague? Those are called wild cards, and very often we'll do contingency planning for scenarios that don't have much likelihood, but their impact would be catastrophic, 10 plus. In that case, yeah, we want to prepare a contingent strategy. Now, there's a problem with this diagram, and I've identified it in the bottom and highlighted it with yellow. And sometime I'm going to have to publish an article to just talk about this. But there's really a third dimension in a correct contingency criticality matrix. That's a term I made up. And that is imminence. Let me give you an example. What is the likelihood that a large meteor will strike Earth and cause catastrophic damage approaching elimination of the human race? Well, that's happened already when it wiped out the dinosaurs. If I remember my history correctly, and more importantly, if I'm to understand what the astronomers tell us, there's the likelihood that an asteroid will hit Earth, as it has in the past, and wipe out a lot of life is almost 100%. So the impact would be catastrophic. The likelihood is a 10. Impact is a 10 plus. Should we be preparing contingency plans for that scenario? And the answer is maybe, but we don't have to be in a hurry because the imminence is not high. It's not going to happen anytime soon. At least that's what the astronomers are telling us. So there's a third dimension, and it's imminence. If the likelihood is relatively high, and the scenario could occur within the next year or two, I think even and the impact is high. Let's say the impact is high, the likelihood is 50%, but the imminence, if it does happen, would be within a year or two. I think we ought to be very busy preparing contingent strategies for this thing. We really need 3-dimension contingency criticality matrices. There you go. Okay, so, but normally the 2 dimensions that futurists talk about and that we're going to talk about for the rest of this video is this 2-dimension matrix which looks at impact and likelihood. So with that, I'm going to try to come back up. Yeah, there we go. So we've prepared scenarios and we've identified the high impact scenarios that warrant our greatest attention. So what do? We prepare responses to those contingencies. Those that have the highest scores are the ones that we're going to prepare the most highly developed strategies for. Now, there's only one that we're going to develop a full-scale strategic plan for, and that's the one with the highest likelihood, of course. And that, as I mentioned earlier, that scenario becomes the basis and provides the assumptions for our prevailing strategic plan. The others we want to watch out for, so we go into environmental monitoring. We watch those scenarios. We don't do this thing just once a year or every 3 years, God forbid, like some companies do, or 4. But instead, the planning department or our consulting planners, I used to manage a firm that did strategic planning, provided strategic planning services to clients. And one of the things that you can ask a consulting firm to do is keep an eye on these contingencies for you. In any event, if you've got low impact, low likelihood scenarios, you're probably not going to prepare responses in very great detail. But higher impact, higher likelihood plans will. The key is to reassess the scenarios and identify new possibilities as technology changes, as the economy, markets, and industry change, as socio-political dimensions change. These things are changing all the time. We said that at the beginning of this video. If that's the case, we don't want to wait until it's planning season in our corporation to form a new scenario. If a new technology arrives, if a new method of diagnosing or treating a dreaded disease occurs, what are we going to do? We're going to wait and say, well, gee, you know, it's only March and we don't do our strategic planning until September and October. We'll get around to it then. No way. Yeah. What if a competitor is discovered to be developing a new product that will conceivably obsolete ours? And say, well, it's only March, you know, so we'll definitely look at that in September. Are you kidding me? No, no, no. Contingency planning is something just like strategic planning that should be done continuously. And one of the favorite complaints of the adherents, the critics of strategic planning is that it's done artificially. It's just a procedure that is done once a year, and then the plan is put in a desk drawer until planning season rolls around in the next year. That certainly does happen in some companies. What a shame. Good strategic planning, like good contingency planning, is done continuously. Okay, and finally, when a scenario is assessed to have a higher probability and impact and imminence, but a higher probability than the assumptions in our prevailing plan, we replace those assumptions with the conjectures in our scenario and the strategies that we've formed to respond to them. We put the contingent strategy or the contingency plan into the comprehensive strategic plan. And that comprehensive strategic plan then is up to date, valid, and vital. That's good strategic planning. And the message in this video is that good strategic planning, good comprehensive strategic planning, has to be accompanied by good contingency planning. Today, contingency planning is, if not the state of our planning art, it's an essential ingredient of it. And with that, I'm going to try to end this video without getting real clumsy with this machine here. I guess the first thing to do, and which I should have done a long time ago, is to stop sharing. But I have to, there we go. So I hope that this little video has given you some insight into contingency planning and the use of scenarios in order to make your strategic planning more effective and more valuable. If you're a strategic planner, it will probably also make your peers in the management team appreciate your value a lot more. Goodbye.